Hello and welcome to Historia Romana. Episode 10. Two Kings, One City. Beyond the administrative and religious reforms discussed in the last episode, we have little knowledge of the events that actually transpired during the joint reign of Romulus and Titus Tatius. The sources claim that Romulus and Tatius actually got along together fairly well, with the two almost always taking the same side on any given issue, though whether this was because of similar dispositions or just political expediency, we are not sure. The fact that the kings lived in two separate palaces, Romulus on the Palatine, Tatius on the Saturnine, certainly points to an attempt to avoid domestic conflict. Also around this time, Romulus finally found himself a wife, Roussy, the Sabine woman that had led the other women out onto the battlefield to stop the fighting. Plutarch claims that they had two children together, Prima and Avilius, but this was never cited by any other ancient source, and even Plutarch himself appears skeptical, indicating that they either died young or never existed at all. The only military event we know about from this time is Rome's war with Cameria, a Latin settlement near the border of Sabine. Cameria was a town with a very similar reputation as Romulus's Rome, a den of criminals and thieves who constantly aggravated their neighbors. Sometime after the abduction of the Sabine women, Camerini bandits began specifically targeting Romans who traveled through their lands. Because of the general outrage towards Rome over the abduction incident and the several other conflicts that Romulus was involved in, these highway robberies were initially ignored. After the Battle of the Lacus Curtius, however, these attacks began to escalate as the Camerini began raiding into Roman territory, stealing their farm animals and grain supplies. Rather than rush back into war, Romulus and Tatius first attempted diplomacy, demanding that the government of Cameria punish the raiders and pay restitution for the damages. The Camerini government, either intimidated by or sympathetic to the raiders, refused, and the attacks only continued to escalate. Left with no choice, Romulus and Tatius led an army north and defeated the Camerini in a pitched battle, later besieging and capturing their town. They disarmed the inhabitants and claimed a third of their land, which they distributed among their own people. When the Camerini bandits hid out in the rural hinterlands and continued to harass the new settlers, the Romans remobilized and defeated the raiders a second time. In total, the joint reign of Romulus and Tatius lasted 5 years before the Sabine king met an unfortunate end. It seems that Talus Tyrannius, one of Tatius's associates, had organized a band of robbers who led a particularly devastating raid into the territory of Laurentum, according to Livy, and/or Lavinium, according to Dionysius, both of which were revered settlements due to their connections to Aeneas. When ambassadors from the targeted settlements came to Rome to demand retribution, Romulus agreed that the robbers should be handed over. Tatius, however, refused to sell out his friend and demanded that the accused at least be tried in Rome rather than in a foreign city. The ambassadors could not agree to this and promptly left Rome, leaving both sides with a sense of resentment. Some angry Sabine residents, likely including the robbers themselves, pursued the ambassadors out of the city and attacked them while they slept, stealing their belongings from their tents and killing anyone who tried to fight back. Some of the ambassadors escaped, however, and opinion towards Rome plummeted even further. Upon learning of the scandal and eager to avoid yet another war, Romulus took matters into his own hands and ordered the robbers arrested and handed over to the offended cities. Tatius, not willing to let his friend be hauled off in chains, organized another group of Sabines and hastened to intercept the prisoners, forcibly releasing them from the custody of Romulus's ambassadors. There are two accounts for how Titus Tatius ultimately died. The first states that Tatius went to Lavinium alone immediately after freeing the prisoners, intending to persuade the aggrieved parties to forgive the offenders. When the angry people discovered that the guilty men had not been handed over to them, as mandated by Romulus, the townspeople attacked Tatius, whereupon he was stoned to death. The other version asserts that Tatius returned back to Rome with the rescued prisoners, where he presumably had a cold reception with Romulus. Shortly afterwards, the two kings traveled to Lavinium for a sacred Latin festival. During this visit, the friends and relatives of the murdered ambassadors assassinated him at the altar, employing knives and spits typically used for cutting and roasting oxen. Now assuming sole rulership for the second time, Romulus was left holding the bag for Tatius's actions. Talus and the other bandits chose to flee Rome rather than wait for Romulus's crackdown, and so there was little he could do other than formally exile them from the city so that they could not return. Likewise, the leaders of the aggrieved city recognized that the assassination of a foreign king had gone too far, and so handed over the principal participants of the murder for punishment. The accused argued that they had merely sought to avenge violence with violence, and Romulus, recognizing the validity of their plea, absolved them of the murder and sent them home. With the joint union now over, the Sabine city of Camerini reasserted their independence, and Romulus was happy to let them go. The Sabine leaders residing in Rome demanded that Romulus take action to avenge their fallen king, but he ignored them. Moreover, he refused to let them even elect another co-king in Tatius's place. Romulus would be their only king from now on. While more than a few Sabine residents were upset with this, most of the Romans, and especially the soldiers, continued to support him. However, this meant that Romulus's workload would be effectively doubled now that his co-king was gone, and so Romulus began to rely more and more on the Senate for advice and supervision. The next few years wouldn't get any easier, as trouble was once again brewing on Rome's frontiers, though now from an entirely new opponent. Thank you for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe. Until next time.